Now today we're doing things slightly differently. Modula Mofolo, MD of Utho Capital Fund Managers, joins us now to take a look at her particular fund, which doesn't necessarily invest in equities, but rather in infrastructural development. You can elaborate a little bit further on this for us, please.
Thanks, Kevin. We are a small fund that has been mandated to finance SMEs in the infrastructure development space. We also look at construction and property development. So it's a fairly niche fund, and I suppose what makes it special is that it looks at SME projects.
The kind of projects that the SMEs deal with, what kind are they?
We're seeing a lot of black-owned construction firms with projects that are backed by government tenders. So these are SMEs that will be awarded tenders or contracts in low-cost housing, healthcare, build clinics and schools, in education, and such critical infrastructure project to government.
It is quite important, but more importantly, where does the money come from? Who are some of the people that contribute to your fund?
Our investors are development finance institutions. It's IDC, and the then Kula, which is now SIFA, and the fund sponsor, which is Utho Capital. So because of the mandate of our investors, which is developmental in outlook, the fund carries through that developmental outlook. So we typically would finance businesses that are unable to secure or access funding from commercial banks.
Julie, in Cape Town, tell me about infrastructure rollout in South Africa, because presumably it's South Africa that you're concentrating on. We can talk about infrastructure, we can talk about hospitals, we can talk about roads, we can talk about ports, but are we lagging behind, and are we lagging behind in infrastructure development because of bureaucracy, because of red tape? What is your opinion? Because you're obviously dealing at the ground floor level with the type of projects that you've been speaking about that need to be funded.
You're absolutely right, Lindsay. There's definitely a lag in infrastructure development in South Africa for the very reasons that you have given, because you'd find that in some instances, say construction, for example, these entrepreneurs are granted contracts on the back of a tender, they deliver, and sometimes there's a delay in payment from the off-taker. And in other instances, there's other bureaucratic related delays. However, there is activity because government is prioritizing certain projects like housing, like schools, like healthcare. So I think it's more a sector issue, and also whether that particular project is a priority project to that particular government department.
Recently, the finance minister came out and said that the government requires about 2 years to build some fiscal room. That obviously I would take to mean that there's going to be either a cut or like a reduction in the growth of spending going forward. Has that affected you to any extent? Are you seeing fewer tenders come through for projects, or has things gone as normal?
No, I think at the SME level, things are relatively going as normal, because what tends to happen is that the entrepreneurs that we finance tend to be subcontractors of the bigger contractors. So you might find that that particular lag is felt by the main contractors, the bigger firms, than the smaller guys that we tend to finance. So even if the major project is delayed, you find that there's still work downstream that is continuously carrying on. So we're actually seeing quite a lot of volume because of the smaller scale of the projects that we look at.
What does it say for your success rate there?
Well, it's been relatively a good run. The fund is only 3 years old. Its targeted IRR is 23%. We're currently sitting at 17% 3 years in. And I think to finance small businesses and have a current book and no arrears is not a small feat. So for the type of transactions that we do and the difficult space that we're in, I think the fund is doing relatively well.
If you were an owner of an SME, how would they get into contact with you? Does it happen automatically when they get the tender, or do they come and seek you after they've gotten the tender?
They typically, well, we get a bit of both. There are some who hear about us and then they inquire to say, if I get a deal, what do I do? There are some who come to us with contracts already. And I think the sad part for us is we see a lot of entrepreneurs that are given massive contracts, but they're not able to implement them because they can't get that funding to unlock their project's cash flows, which is what our funding does. It usually just funds them to procure the initial materials they need and do the initial work, get those first payment certificates, and then it starts flowing from there.
You mentioned an IRR of 17% so far. When it comes to ownership, more equity or debt split, how does it work?
We're currently sitting at a 34-66 split with 34% equity and 66% debt. And the reason being that because we're seeing more construction deals and they tend to be short-term in nature, the fund is now suddenly skewed more towards debt than equity because of those short-term equity transactions short-term debt transactions made in construction mainly.
What about the level of interest from investors? You mentioned the fund is only 3 years old. Are you finding that angel investors are coming forward, or even private equity wants to partner up with you?
Look, there is interest in growing the fund further. However, because of its South Africa only mandate, a lot of the investors that were initially very keen to come on board have been deterred because they want to go into Africa. You know, there's massive infrastructure need in West Africa, for example. Nigeria needs electrification urgently, and so many other countries in Africa. So they tend to be interested to go broader than South Africa. Now, the current investors are more keen to develop entrepreneurs within South Africa. So there has been that mismatch and our inability to attract investors that are looking beyond South Africa.
Are you looking to change that?
We're looking to start raising capital for Fund 2, which will have a broader mandate. So this fund will continue and then Fund 2 will run in tandem, but with a more open mandate to go beyond South Africa.
Viv, I'm not too sure if this is something that might appeal you. It's a solid story, and we are in need of local infrastructural development. It almost sounds like potential for one to tap into.
I was actually taking part in the infrastructure in Durban, I think it was 2 months ago. And the interesting thing there was that, you know, a couple of years ago, there was like maybe a 40 or $50 billion deficit in terms of infrastructure funding for Africa. And at that fund, actually, it was that in Durban, it appeared almost that the gap had been closed and we had gone on the other way. There's just so much money flowing into Africa for infrastructure development at the moment. They've closed that deficit to a certain extent. You know, the Chinese want to invest, the international funds want to invest, even the local investors like in South Africa. There's money flowing in, so the opportunity for infrastructure growth in this and the continent as a whole is going to be huge. We're talking about in excess of 100 billion a year.
So clearly you're onto something. Maybe with all that money floating around, is there enough talent and the money that this hands is falling into? Are they enabled enough to carry these projects on?
Look, we are a black female-owned fund, and our staff are predominantly black investment professionals. And one of the biggest challenges we face in sourcing talent is finding black professionals, well, not necessarily only black, but finding professionals investment professionals that have a clear understanding of SME funding, because that's very different from funding any other mid-cap, say, type of transaction. But they are out there and we are growing the team, but the one challenge that we faced was always finding people that understand the nuances of development finance.
Viv interestingly mentioned that there is a lot of international interest in African infrastructure. Are you looking at potentially partnering up with an international player in the long term?
There are quite a few, especially coming out of the US, that are interested, and I think going forward we'll channel those interests into Fund 2 because they are definitely looking to go into Africa. And on the South African landscape, for example, recently GE South Africa just recently set up a massive fund, and one of the areas of interest is infrastructure development. So there is a keen interest in developing infrastructure in Africa.
Tapping into potential on the continent. Thank you so much for your time today this evening. That was Modula Mofolo, MD for the Utho Capital Fund Managers.